Well, good morning, everyone. As you might have seen when Carmen announced this, the topic this morning is on dogma, doctrine, and discipline, the 3 Ds, if you will. And this is apropos of it's always good to go back to some fundamentals, especially when with some of the current issues that are in the air these days with Pope Francis and his latest letter, among other things that just come up in the normal course of being a Catholic or a Christian today. So Carmen thought it a good topic, and it is always a good topic to cover, to bring clarity to what we mean by the terms of dogma, doctrine, and discipline. I'd also just add a quick commercial for the Summer School of Faith, which starts Tuesday, June 14th at Gorton. So we're here for this session, but all of the Summer School of Faith sessions Tuesday at 7 p.m. at Gorton. And the topic there is apologetics, which is really an area that for Catholics, there used to be a lot of apologetic books written in the 20th century, in the early part of the 20th century, but there hasn't been so much published recently that is useful, helpful, or contemporary to what current people who may not even be Christian, let alone Catholic, are thinking about. And so apologetics is that part of theology that traditionally dealt with questions prior to belief. Why is the Catholic belief or Christian belief reasonable and historical in the first place? So that's coming this summer, and you'll hear more about that in those sessions and as you see other advertisements for it. You have a handout. I hope everyone has a handout, and it's double-sided. So when I refer to the other side of it, you'll just flip it over. But I thought before we jump into the topic for this morning that we would review what I call the levels of teaching in the church, because it informs and provides a framework for understanding dogma, doctrine, and discipline. So I'd ask you to look at that. And that page is really a reflection of Vatican II, the dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium, and in particular paragraph 25. This isn't necessarily new, but it's good to go over it again, which we'll do together, and then move to the next topic of dogma. So when you think about the different levels of teaching authority in the church, they range from very formal occasions of what are called extraordinary and universal, when the Pope is defining a Marian dogma, for example, or an ecumenical council like the Council of Trent or Vatican I or Vatican II, all the way down to the Pope giving a private audience to 10 individuals, and he says things. So you see there's a wide range of occasions by which the Pope or bishops speak on different subjects. So that's what this first page is trying to show. So let's go through each one of them. The first one, when the Pope is speaking what's called ex cathedra, from the chair, is considered extraordinary and universal. And what is meant by that is that he is proposing a doctrine to be held by the church universally and to be held of faith. Not an opinion, not a conjecture, not a musing, not thoughts about will the Cubs win the World Series or not this year. But rather, it is a formal declaration that what he is proposing is a matter of faith divinely revealed. And our response is one of faith. And we'll get into why are we calling that out, but our response is correlated to the level and dignity of the teaching. So our response is the full assent of faith. But there's also other examples of extraordinary and universal teaching, which is infallible on faith and morals, namely an ecumenical council properly convened and blessed by the Pope. So there have been approximately, I believe it's 21 ecumenical councils, starting with the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, all the way through to Vatican II. 21 ecumenical councils throughout the life of the church, where bishops and, if the Pope was not there, his legates were there, and then later confirmed by him, have met to decide and define questions of dogma and doctrine. So, for example, the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD defined dogmas about who is Jesus Christ. He's God and man. The Council of Trent defined dogmas around grace and free will, around the sacraments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So an ecumenical council in union with the Pope, because there have been some councils held without the Pope that are later deemed invalid, can and does define dogmas definitively to be held of faith. And our response, again, is faith. Our response to that is assent of faith. There's another class of teaching called ordinary and universal, because if you think about it, there's only been 21 ecumenical councils in 2,000 years, so they're not that frequent. And popes don't often exercise their exclusive ex cathedra authority. The most obvious examples are the Marian dogmas of the Assumption and the Immaculate Conception. So it's rather infrequent that those two things are happening. But obviously the Church wants to guide the faithful continually. And so the ordinary and universal teaching of the Church is often what we see in the press or coming from the Church. And this is when bishops proposing something, even throughout the world, which is what disperse means. They may not be together in a council or a synod, but they're proposing something that is basically a retelling or a rephrasing or restating defined church teaching. And this happens all the time. So for example, the Church talking about the evils of abortion. Abortion and the evil of abortion or murder has always been considered a moral evil, and that's a inviolable dogma of the Church. It's not changing, it will never change. So the direct taking of innocent human life intentionally is something that's always going to be wrong. If the Pope is giving a statement on this, it may not require a council, doesn't require him to make an ex cathedra statement. He's just repeating accepted church teaching in the ordinary course of doing his job. Or any bishop in his diocese who might write a letter to the people in his diocese on abortion or on other issues in bioethics that are directly related to that, like euthanasia. So these are all examples of ordinary and universal teaching, but it's not exercised officially in those first two ways of the Pope speaking ex cathedra or an ecumenical council. Then we get into another class of the Pope speaking on something, and it's authoritative, but it may not be infallible if he's not repeating dogma. It might be his thoughts on a particular subject. And in the literature from the Congregation on the Doctrine of the Faith, this involves often what they call contingent or conjectural elements. And so this teaching is characterized as authoritative, but not necessarily infallible or not infallible at all. And the examples I think of this are, let's take an example of an encyclical from John the 23rd, who was Pope in the 1950s, on farm policy in Europe. Is that infallible? No, it's not. It's not, because he is trying to apply Catholic social principles to what he perceives as the plight of farmers in Europe. Now, we wouldn't begrudge any Christian leader, pope, bishop, or layperson from speaking about the plights of injustices throughout the world. That's part of our heritage. You think of the Old Testament prophets. So the official status of the Pope or the bishops doesn't prevent them from speaking out on a wide range of issues. Another obvious example in our time is the Pope's encyclical where he's talking about air pollution and global warming, and that the primary causes of that are burning fossil fuels. Now that's a conjecture based upon the scientists that he's influenced by. And so there are arguments to suggest that burning fossil fuels is the primary cause of global warming, but there's also a body of literature that shows that CO2 is actually a very small percent of the total greenhouse effect in the atmosphere. Now, Pope Francis has chosen not to heed that body of literature on global warming, but you see now we're in the area of conjecture and contingent facts and findings. So that is not infallible. And in fact, it's not even an object of infallibility, which is faith and morals. Air pollution doesn't fall into either of those categories. And the fact that there's controversy scientifically about is it primary or secondary or tertiary, the burning of fossil fuels as it relates to the greenhouse effect on the atmosphere, that's still being debated, even though you might not hear about it so often. So you see what I'm getting at is that to the extent a papal encyclical or teaching or audience that he gives is based upon contingent or conjectural elements, to that extent, we read it respectfully, it's certainly not infallible, and it's possibly even deficient. So on these contingent and conjectural elements I'm talking about, and I just gave you a few examples of that. The bishops, in the same way, have an ordinary exercise of their teaching office in their diocese. To the extent they repeat the faith that's universally held, that's authoritative. But it's not infallible, again, if they go into areas that involve subjective conditions. It might be on what should the minimum wage be. You have some bishops who would like to opine on what they think that is. You can obviously see that whether it's $9 an hour or $11 an hour, we are a long way away from faith and morals. And when bishops do that, they are then subject to the same critique an economist would be on the effect of unemployment or employment on various groups of people. The responses there, you notice, have changed, by the way, on the last two we just talked about. The religious submission of intellect and will is out of the posture of faith, but an act of faith is not required because it's not that level of teaching. So on the examples that I've been giving, there is a respect for an encyclical and what it's proposing and teaching, and we should read it and listen to it and think about it. But it doesn't command the same kind of response as the dogmas on Mary or on the Trinity or on the real presence in the Eucharist do from us to be considered faithful Catholics. The last teaching office that the Church will speak to is that of theologians. And this was more confused 40 years ago and 30 years ago when there's a lot more public dissent among Catholic theologians. And a lot of the progress that's been made here through John Paul II and Benedict of crushing these people and removing them from their teaching offices, maybe not as fast or as rapid as we would have liked, but you don't see as much as you did in the 80s. You know, the people like Charles Curran are long gone teaching at Protestant universities or secular universities. Others like that have died off happily. So, so you see less of this, and it was much more of an issue 30 years ago. But theologians have a teaching office too. It just happens not to be authoritative, and their arguments are given the respect on the merits of their arguments. So if they might have 3 PhDs behind their name, but if they're spouting things that just are not accurate, not true, they could have 10 PhDs. It has no bearing on our allegiance to that or even its authority. They have no formal authority like the Pope and the bishops do when they teach. So it's all based upon the merits of their arguments. And there are obviously good theologians out there too who can be very effective teachers, and we all probably have names that come to mind of priests and laymen out there who are excellent teachers of the faith in universities and who publish books, etc. So I just wanted to provide this skeleton before we then turn to the subject for this morning. Are there any comments or questions on this? I'll just read quickly then from Vatican II, the Dogmatic Constitution on the Church. It's not in your packet or your two-pager, but it's paragraph 25 for your reference. And it's a very concise statement of everything I've just gone over. So it reads, quote, "Among the principal duties of bishops, the preaching of the gospel occupies an eminent place. For bishops are preachers of the faith who lead new disciples to Christ, and they are authentic teachers, teachers endowed with the authority of Christ, who preach to the people committed to them the faith they must believe and put into practice, and by the light of the Holy Spirit illustrate that faith. They bring forth from the treasury of revelation new things and old, making it bear fruit and vigilantly warding off any errors that threaten their flock. Bishops teaching in communion with the Roman pontiff are to be respected by all as witnesses to divine and Catholic truth. In matters of faith and morals, the bishops speak in the name of Christ, and the faithful are to accept their teaching and to adhere to it with religious assent. This religious submission of mind and will must be shown in a special way to the authentic magisterium of the Roman pontiff, even when he's not speaking ex cathedra. That is, it must be shown in such a way that his supreme magisterium is acknowledged with reverence, its judgments made by him are sincerely adhered to according to his manifest mind and will. His mind and will in the matter may be known either from the character of the documents, from his frequent repetition of the same doctrine, or from his manner of speaking." So I'll stop there because you can see how the Council is pointing out to even the occasions on which the Pope speaks is an indicator of the level of the message. So for example, if the Pope is giving an audience to the nuns visiting from Hungary, that's generally not the occasion for him to surprise the world with a dogma. It just isn't. It isn't the right occasion. It's not the right forum. Also, there are different types of documents that the Pope will generate, from encyclicals to apostolic exhortations to private audiences, as I mentioned, to apostolic letters. They all have a different range of authority, historically speaking. So that's what Vatican II is trying to get at. And continuing then, although individual bishops do not enjoy the prerogative of infallibility, they nevertheless proclaim Christ's doctrine infallibly whenever, even though dispersed throughout the world, but still maintaining the bond of communion among themselves and with the successor of Peter, and authentically teaching matters of faith and morals, they are in agreement on one position as definitively to be held. That's why I use that language, definitive, to be definitively held, because it comes right from Vatican II. This is even more clearly verified when gathered together in an ecumenical council. They are teachers and judges of faith and morals for the universal church, whose definitions must be adhered to with the submission of faith. So that's, you can see that's now a different level. We're now at the level of dogma and our response being faith. And just continuing then, and then we'll move on to the next topic. And this infallibility with which the divine Redeemer willed his church to be endowed in defining doctrine of faith and morals extends as far as the deposit of revelation extends, which must be religiously guarded and faithfully expounded. And this is the infallibility which the Roman pontiff, the head of the College of Bishops, enjoys in virtue of his office, when as the supreme shepherd and teacher of the faithful, who confirms his brethren in their faith, by a definitive act, he proclaims a doctrine of faith or morals. And therefore his definitions of themselves, and not from the consent of the church, are justly styled irreformable, since they are pronounced with the assistance of the Holy Spirit promised to him in Blessed Peter, and therefore they need no approval of others, nor do they allow an appeal to any other judgment. For then the Roman pontiff is not pronouncing judgment as a private person, but as the supreme teacher of the universal church, in whom the charism of infallibility of the church itself is individually present. He is expounding or defending a doctrine of Catholic faith. The infallibility promised to the church resides also in the body of bishops when that body exercises the supreme magisterium with the successor of Peter. To these definitions, the assent of the church can never be wanting, on account of the activity of that same Holy Spirit by which the whole flock of Christ is preserved and progresses in the unity of faith. So those paragraphs from Vatican II, basically, I've summarized on this first page of the level of teaching in the church. So just to review, authoritative, infallible, definitive, Pope speaking ex cathedra by virtue of his office, the church gathered in an ecumenical council, blessed by the Pope with the bishop's presence. Those are authoritative, definitive, and infallible declarations on faith and morals. Bishops dispersed throughout the world can repeat that teaching infallibly, and is to be held as a matter of faith, as well as the Pope. When we get into secondary situations, encyclicals, private audiences, a bishop in his diocese, speaking on other topics that are related to the faith but not directly related to faith and morals, that has authoritative status, but it is not necessarily infallible. And there may be, as I say, conjectural or contingent factors or issues in the things they're talking about that make them reformable or corrected as time goes on. So any comments or questions on that before we move to the next page? So this is fairly standard stuff, yes. I will get to that toward the end.
Where does that fall?
That's an apostolic letter,
Okay.
and so it's a little bit below the dignity of an encyclical. But I would say, not to brush off that question, because it's in part why we're all meeting, there was no new doctrine proposed in that letter. If you read all the way through, what you have is a elaboration of the pastoral care of people in irregular marriages or irregular situations. So I'll have a little bit more to say about that in a moment, but there was no new doctrine, and he even said, I'm not proposing in the letter, I'm not proposing any new doctrine. I'm trying to elaborate strategies for helping people who are outside the church due to their circumstances, a way back in for them. So there was a lot of heat and energy around, oh, he's contradicting X, Y, and Z, but there was no new doctrine proposed in that. And you can read that in the letter itself, as well as the Cardinal Schonberg, who held the press conference to publish the letter, said that there's no new doctrine being proposed. And Pope Francis later in an interview said the Cardinal is exactly right. So if you think about the battle lines that were being drawn at the synods, where some bishops did want new doctrine, they didn't get it. Okay. But we'll have more to say about that when we go. So if you turn your page to Dogma, Doctrine, and Discipline, and you'll see this in the book that Carmen was referring to, Ludwig Ott, on dogma. This is the classical layout of how we understand dogma, doctrine, and discipline. So Ludwig Ott and others will talk about the truths of revelation, divine revelation, and make a distinction between things that are primary, directly revealed by God, and then things that are revealed by God under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to the church. And even though there's a distinction we make, there's really no distinction in terms of whether it is held of faith or not. It's just maybe a theological, technical distinction. But dogma is formally defined, those things of faith. De fide, you've heard that term before maybe, or de fide definita, of faith, formally defined to be held definitively. But again, it's any time the church gathers either in an ecumenical council or the Pope speaking officially, where they want to specify or determine more precisely a doctrine to be of faith to the status of a dogma. So the examples I give there are the Articles of the Creed, the Trinity, Jesus Christ, all of the dogmatic statements by the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Ephesus, the Council of Chalcedon, all of the dogmatic work that was done in those councils made dogmatic statements about Jesus Christ. The sacraments, the 7 sacraments being instituted by Christ that give grace as outward signs. We all remember those formulations. The Marian dogmas, the dogma on original sin, and so on. I won't read all those, but the point I will make is that they also extend into morals. So many, again, it was the controversy for a while that, well, can the church really make a dogmatic statement about things in the moral area? Because that has a lot of contingent elements too. And the answer is, of course, yes. And the 10 Commandments, the Sermon on the Mount, are all part of the divine treasury of what has been revealed by God through Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit. So the answer is yes. And we could list more here. Abortion, adultery, fornication, theft are all biblical sins, if you will, all clearly called out as wrong. Unlike a ventilator on a person who's in the hospital. They didn't have ventilators 2,000 years ago. So you see how it's a good example of how the church has to develop its understanding. But we wouldn't call, and we wouldn't expect to hear, the dogma on the care of elderly people. It wouldn't make any sense because it already has a contingent element to it, namely technology of medical hospitals. So you begin to see the difference. The dogmas that I'm talking about here are directly revealed by God, and there's very little ambiguity about what they are. And so that's really that primary object of faith to be held definitively. I mentioned a second area here, and I describe it as truths that are connected to dogma as implications of them. So, for example, we have the dogma of Christ being human and divine. Is there a dogma that says that Jesus laughed? There isn't, but it's doctrinal or dogmatic to think so because it's part of being a human being. Did Jesus have, if we think of the dogma of the resurrection, an implication of that is we will not find the bones of Jesus in this world. That's an implication of the dogma of the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. But you won't see that defined anywhere, but it's an implication of it. Some things are defined because they're being debated as a authentic development from dogmas. But you see the difference. A doctrine is something to be held of faith. It's no less authoritative than a dogma, but we've come at it through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, through councils, through papal declarations. And I try to give examples of this. In order for an ecumenical council to be considered advancing divine faith, it has to be viewed as authentic. So the celebration of an ecumenical council is an implication of the church's mission to teach authoritatively. If the church couldn't do this, it couldn't fulfill its mission. So one of the things that's always put first is the fact that the church can hold ecumenical councils to define things. So that's one. Another is the legitimacy of a papal election, properly convened. If we didn't believe that, you couldn't have popes exercising their authority. So you see, these are not primary objects of faith. They are secondary objects of faith that are required and implied by the primary objects of faith. The canonization of saints. Every time a pope canonizes someone, that's an exercise of infallible judgment. And that's an example of, people sometimes say, well, the pope only does that, he's only done it twice for the two Marian dogmas. Well, actually, he's doing that every time he canonizes someone. He's exercising an infallible act by declaring someone to be a saint. They are in heaven, they are worthy of prayers, they are worthy of imitation, and so on. That is an infallible statement. You might remember this from your study. Toward the end of the 19th century, Pope Leo declared Anglican orders as null and void. There had been theological opinion up to that point and controversy of what is the status of the Anglican faith. And Pope Leo XIII settled that question by saying, I declare definitively that the Anglican orders are null and void. In other words, their ordinations are not valid. They cannot validly say the Mass. So they're in the same category as Methodists and Episcopalians and so on as it relates to their sacramental orders. That is something that is a doctrine. You wouldn't call that the dogma of the invalidity of Anglican orders. I mean, it's clunky. But it is a doctrine to be held infallibly. Continuing, the affirmation of in the conjugal act in heterosexual marriage that life and love must be present. That affirmation of that teaching of humane vitae, and then repeated by John Paul II, the core of that is infallibly taught. And it is a doctrine. And sometimes it's phrased negatively as contraception, but it is actually an affirmation of that life and love must be present in the marital act between couples in marriage. And so that's what's being affirmed. If we get into issues of, well, my wife has a medical condition that requires taking medication that also has the effect of rendering her infertile at certain points, that's justified under the principle of double effect. That is an allowable use of a medical procedure or pharmacy that would prevent conception. But that's not what the church is talking about. It's affirming that life and love must be present in the marital act. So that's taught infallibly, but there can be examples where that teaching is developed and extended, which are those contingent elements I've been talking about earlier. You know, there are other examples. Last summer we talked about the Catholic social teaching and those principles, and there were 7 or 8 of them. For example, the principle of private property, of solidarity, the principle of subsidiarity, and there are other principles. Those are infallibly taught, and they're part of the church's moral teaching. Their application is another topic which we'll get to in a second, but those principles and all of the core moral principles of the Catholic Church are taught infallibly. Doctrinally, though, you wouldn't call a dogma of the principle of private property. It doesn't make any sense. It's a doctrine. The next layer here then is the ordinary teaching proposed as true or at least as sure but not definitive or final. And so these are what I'll call doctrinal. You can call them doctrine, but they don't enjoy the same prerogative of infallibility as the first two do. And this is where we get into the area of application of those principles. So you see there's a certain wisdom here because there are contingent elements in the application of any principle. Your right to private property as a principle is assured. But what about in wartime situation? If you think about it, the application of a principle is different than the principle. So the principle of private property, as an example, is a bedrock of Catholic social teaching. Does that mean you can do anything you want with your property? No. Does it mean the government in extreme situations can commandeer your property? Yes, it does. Related to the common good. So the principle is assured. When we get into applications, that's where we have to use our head. So we are not just simply reading dogmas and doctrines blindly. We actually have to apply them to open-ended situations that may come up. So examples of this that I also mention, conditions for the use of capital punishment by the state. So this gets confused often in our culture today, even by, I'm sad to say, even by priests and bishops. But the church has always affirmed the right of the state to exercise the use of capital punishment, and that hasn't changed. What has developed, perhaps, and it's based upon an assessment of conjectural and contingent elements by John Paul II and by others, is that have we reached a point in first world nations where the use of capital punishment by the state is no longer necessary? Pope John Paul II concluded, yes, we've reached that point where in order to promote a culture of life, the execution of criminals guilty of capital crimes in first world countries is no longer needed. That assessment he's making is a prudential judgment. He's attempting to promote a greater culture of life. Things can go back to the second and third worlds very quickly. And so you can see how if you lived in a part of the world where there was no police force, there were no courts, there were no jails, you would have a different opinion. Say certain jungles in Africa run by Christians surrounded by Muslim tribes. You might have a militia that would take a completely different view of this, and I suspect that Pope John Paul II would as well. But if we're talking about the West and first world countries, he's making a judgment that in order to promote a culture of life in the West, which seems bent on promoting a culture of death, the exercise of capital punishment against criminals doesn't accomplish that. That is an argument. But in none of that has the church ever rejected the core right of the state to execute criminals guilty of capital crimes. It's just the overlay today in our media and our culture and with priests and even bishops, unfortunately, is to just immediately go right from the principle to equating the application in first world countries to the principle. If they did that, they'd have a hard time explaining my copy of the Catechism from 1994, which affirms the right of the state to inflict capital punishment, and then the revision 10 years later where it doesn't. So you can see how we're in the area of conjecture and contingent elements, which popes and bishops are certainly allowed to do. So I hope that's clear. I mentioned other things like on global warming and farm policy. These can be revised, and they can often be based, as I've mentioned, on contingent assessments, conjectures, and for that reason, they can be defective in some cases. We shouldn't make a habit of thinking things are defective from the magisterium because they get things right, obviously, more times than they don't on these contingent things. But nevertheless, to the extent when they wade into economic policy, for example, or comments about the United Nations or global international treaties, they are wading into areas that are removed from their province of faith and morals, and they're making prudential judgments that are only as good as the merits of their argument. And then disciplines in the prudential order is the last category there. These are the necessary functional declarations. The Pope might want to create a new diocese in France, as an example. Or a bishop in his diocese might want to issue regulations on how annulments are going to be done in terms of the legislative process, the procedural aspects of it. Maybe the fees, he reduces the fees to get an annulment, for example. So I think the dollar amount fee to get an annulment in the Archdiocese of Chicago is $900. Maybe a bishop says, I'm going to make that $200 to make it more affordable, as an example. So these are procedural, canonical. They can be universal for the whole church. So for example, the Pope wants to introduce another Holy Day of Obligation, or they can be specific to a diocese. And this is where we are in terms of what the questions that came up earlier on Pope Francis's apostolic letter on the joy of love and the pastoral care of people in irregular situations. And so we are in the level of disciplines, of directives to bishops, priests, and lay people in terms of how we accompany people in irregular situations who would like to come back into the church more fully. We're in the area of what I'll call tactics. We're in the area of how do we interact prudentially with people. And you can see that's a different level of teaching and therefore authority. And so that's the layout of what I wanted to formally cover to just address this issue more that came up. I'll start with the apostolic letter of John Paul II, what was called Familiaris Consortio, way back in 1981, where he was talking about how do we face Catholics who are divorced and remarried without an annulment. And basically what he develops is that the Eucharist is more than just receiving the body and blood of Christ. It is a celebration of an identity, of an ecclesial union that we all have with the church. So when we gather for Mass, it's not just a matter of us receiving something, it's also the celebration of an identity. For those who are in an irregular situation of divorce and remarried without an annulment, they have, by that action and by that life choice, have severed that ecclesial unity because they no longer identify with the church teaching on a core issue of the indissolubility of marriage. And so they are not to be admitted to the sacrament. But he goes on to say that there are cases where the circumstances are such that they are unable to get an annulment. And as a result, he says if they go to confession and live as brother and sister, they in private can receive communion. So that's been the standard approach of the church on this subject for a long time, at least certainly for the last 35 years. That the status of people who are divorced and remarried without an annulment, assuming they approach the sacrament of confession and agree to the priest that they will not engage in marital relations any longer, but they will stay together for the sake of their family, their children, etc., they always had an avenue to receive communion privately in order not to give scandal to the broader parish or the church. So that remedy has always been in existence. I will then offer to you a statement of the Congregation by the Doctrine of the Faith in 1994 entitled Communion of Divorced and Remarried. So this was from Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, and it's a follow-on clarification from John Paul II's apostolic letter. So I'll just read this to you. The faithful who persist in such a situation may receive Holy Communion only after obtaining sacramental absolution. So he's referring to that case I just mentioned of a divorced, remarried couple who have not gotten an annulment but who would like to receive communion and are willing to go to confession. So, may receive Holy Communion only after obtaining sacramental absolution, which may be given only to those who, repenting of having broken the sign of the covenant and of fidelity to Christ, are sincerely ready to undertake a way of life that is no longer in contradiction to the indissolubility of marriage. This means in practice that when, for serious reasons, for example, for the children's upbringing, a man and a woman cannot satisfy the obligation to separate, they take on themselves the duty to live in complete continence, that is, by abstinence by and from the acts proper to married couples. In such a case, they may receive Holy Communion as long as they respect the obligation to avoid giving scandal. It goes on, in inviting pastors to distinguish carefully the various situations of the divorced and remarried, the exhortation of John Paul II, Familiaris Consortios, recalls the case of those who are subjectively certain in conscience that their previous marriage is irreparably broken and was never valid. It must be discerned with certainty by means of the external forum established by the Church whether there is objectively such a condition of nullity. That is the tribunal process of an annulment. That's what is meant by the external forum. The example that comes to mind is, and if you think in this country but also more broadly outside of the U.S., suppose someone is married to someone who's a member of the mob, and their marriage was a sham from the beginning due to infidelities of the man. And these are actually not far-fetched cases, by the way. And he, as his wife told him as she was leaving, this is crazy, I'm not staying here anymore, I'm taking the kids. And he says to her, if you ever attempt to divorce or get an annulment, I will kill you. And I'm not cooperating with any tribunal, so you can just forget that, and you're not going to be able to get a hold of me again. You can see how that's next to impossible to advance that in the external forum. So what is the fate of this woman if she remarries and has children from that union? So this declaration goes on. It must be discerned with certainty by means of the external forum, if possible, established by the Church whether there is objectively such a nullity of marriage. The discipline of the Church, while it confirms the exclusive competence of ecclesiastical tribunals with respect to the examination of the validity of the marriage of Catholics, also offers new ways to demonstrate the nullity of a previous marriage in order to exclude as far as possible every divergence between the truth verifiable in the judicial process and the objective truth known by a correct conscience. Adherence to the Church's judgment and observance of the existing discipline concerning the obligation of canonical form necessary for the validity of the marriage of Catholics are what truly contribute to the spiritual welfare of those concerned. The Church is in fact the body of Christ, and to live in ecclesial communion is to live in the body of Christ and to nourish oneself with the body of Christ. With the reception of the sacrament of the Eucharist, communion with Christ, the head, can never be separated from the communion with the members, that is, the Church. For this reason, the sacrament of our union with Christ is also the sacrament of our unity of the Church and in the Church. Receiving Eucharistic communion contrary to ecclesial communion is therefore in itself a contradiction. So you have the finish there of a recircling that, look, you only should receive the Eucharist if you are in proper communion with the Church. That can be achieved through the external forum of an annulment, and in this very discretionary case of the internal forum, as it's called. Now, a lot of people don't know this, and it hasn't been talked about much, but in the case of the woman married to the mobster, she could receive a moral declaration from a priest in consultation with the tribunal that her first marriage was not valid and receive communion privately. So that's been the settled practice of the Church for decades. Now we come to the letter of Pope Francis. Not only is there no new doctrine proposed in that letter, but what he's done is he's in a way that perhaps is confusing to the broader audiences of people who read this or read a news snippet, he has made very public these very highly discretional personal situations which you can't publish general rules on, obviously. Suppose someone said, well, it's not a mobster who's going to kill me, it's just someone who lives in Decatur and I can't get a hold of him. You know, you see how that's completely different. And so it is so hard, and this is where if you'd like to make a criticism of Pope Francis, I think this is where it is. Namely, is it prudent to publish something like this over 300 pages on a topic that is highly discretionary between a priest and the conscience of the person approaching them in a way like this? It's difficult because it then does it create more confusion than it solved. Do we have cases of pastors out there today who are wagging their finger at people who approach them privately looking for help? That's not my experience of the priests and bishops I know. Are there examples of that you could point to? Of course there are. But did they need to hear this guidance this way? Or maybe a memo to their bishop on would have been a more effective way to do this. So that's the critique, respectfully, I would make of the letter, is that this isn't how you do things in a large organization. I think of just my business experience where I used to run facilities that had hundreds and hundreds of hourly people working, and you had HR policies on sexual harassment and other things that were grounds for dismissal, drug use, et cetera, et cetera. And we would publish these policies, and in a union environment, they are very, very well known. And so I remember a case of a maintenance manager who was taking drugs, and it violated the policy, but it so happened that the drugs he was taking were for a rare form of cancer he had that occasionally made him act strangely. I'm not going to publish that in an HR manual. How would you say that in a manual? You may not take drugs unless you have a condition subjectively that you've determined you need to. It's impossible to run an organization like that. You would sit down with the individual privately and say, you'd counsel them on what to do. But you see how it is, leaders and organizations know what to communicate at what level, is the point I'm trying to make. And business leaders face this all the time with what do we publish in terms of our HR policies versus how do we handle one-off situations that are difficult. I had another situation where our quality control manager who was married was dating someone in the customer service department, and they would go to lunch together, and it was becoming a problem for the office because at the Christmas party we would all meet his wife, and yet we knew he was dating someone. So I took him aside privately, and I said to him, look, you're making your personal life my problem. Everyone knows what's going on. You have to stop this, and you have to stop it now. And he did. Now, there was no policy in the HR manual of you may not cheat on your wife. But leaders have to know what to publish at what level to whom and what to handle in the internal forum. And so the critique of Pope Francis on this is that we're not running a lemonade stand here. We are running a universal church, and what you say is going to be read by a wide group of people. And things that should be handled in the internal forum should be handled in the internal forum. That's their critique. So there's no new doctrine. He's not being unfaithful to this. He's not being unfaithful to that. This is a management issue. This is I hate to put it in secular terms, this is a business issue of how to communicate to what groups, what kind of message. I could give you many examples of that where you have HR issues when you're managing large groups of people. And you have to have a policy manual, of course. But you have to know when to stop talking also and when to handle things internally. So that's how I would characterize the letter. And I say that respectfully because Pope Francis, if you read the first 7 chapters, it is a beautiful description of Christian marriage. Heterosexual Christian marriage. Biblically based, goes through church. He was asked, if you think of the initial drafts of the synod documents by the German bishops, they wanted to start with a sociological survey of marriage throughout the world and the different patterns and models of marriage, and what nonsense. And Pope Francis had none of that. It was completely stricken from his final document. So we should be happy that in the first 7 chapters we have a beautiful reaffirmation of Christian marriage. The issue is everyone focuses on the last chapter and the last footnote of that chapter. Yes? That, as I've just read to you, the footnote itself doesn't really contradict the practice of the church. It's actually in continuity with the Congregation Doctrine of the Faith's letter from 1994 on communion and divorced Catholics. So I see it in continuity. I just see it as unwise how it was even formulated this way. Right, so we may not like stylistically how he said that the Eucharist should not be a prize for the perfect. I think that that's tone deaf, so I agree with you. Do we have a problem today of people coming to Mass too much, too often to receive the Eucharist? I don't think so. We have single-digit participation in Europe of Mass attendance on Sunday. So to write something like that is I agree with you, to be not in tune with what's happening in the West in particular. But as I'll say again, in reading, again, the 1994 statement of allowing for an internal forum solution for divorced and remarried Catholics who do not have an annulment, they can receive communion. That is consistent with what he says in that footnote. My beef was, why did you create a hullabaloo about this? 2 synods to merely reaffirm what the church's practices was in a highly discretionary way. That's not responsible as a leader of a worldwide organization, in my opinion. That's the issue. Why? To the point you raised. It's causing confusion. It's causing confusion. Well, maybe on some level, but all I'm saying is what I'm saying, which is it is in continuity with church practice, as we've seen. How it's been communicated has caused confusion. I think both statements can be true. I want to be sensitive to our time. Are there any comments or questions on the topic? I mean, this is a good subject to cover, and everyone wanted to get to this, but the dogma doctrine discipline distinctions are useful, helpful on a variety of issues. We've been talking about this, but the encyclical on global warming is subject to the same kind of critique of conjectural contingent elements that may change. We might discover from science that actually water vapor is formed more often by episodes from the sunspots than burning fossil fuels. So it's helpful to know these distinctions in general and then apply them to situations. But in this last case of Pope Francis on marriage, there's no doctrinal change from what I can see. Yes. So generally speaking, a doctrine can, and the Marian dogmas are an example of that, where the faith of the church on the Immaculate Conception, for example, had been discussed and believed for millennium, or on the Assumption. On capital punishment, we're in the area of application of moral principles by the state in this case. And so the principle of the state having the right to use capital punishment is affirmed. I don't know that it would ever be elevated to the level of a dogma, because the reason to make something a dogma is to resolve a controversy, to provide clarity. The church is trying to act as a service to its members on something that's being debated and discussed endlessly. No one's really debating the right of the state to have this right to execute criminals guilty of capital crimes. The conversation is around the application of that. An example, let's say there's a Christian nation one day that's formed right surrounded by Boko Haram in Africa. That's the example I was thinking of. To survive, to exist, to defend its citizens, you could see how it could obviously have to have the death penalty. So the comment was, I see this as all leading to chaos. And I would say a couple things. Things have been more chaotic, believe it or not, in our history. Think of right after Vatican II, the Mass being in English and all the innovations that began to start happening. That was pretty chaotic. You can go back in time in the church when there were 3 people claiming to be Pope in the 15th century, or in the end of the 14th century.
It tossed St. Athanasius out, too.
Right. Think of the 4th century. There were more Arian bishops, heretical bishops who thought Jesus was not God, than there were Orthodox bishops. And St. Athanasius was one of those bishops who, he was thrown out of his diocese 5 times. He had to live in the hills while the Greek emperors were purging out all the Orthodox Catholics. Think about the French Revolution, where they were putting the Eucharist into cannons and shooting it against the people they were killing with it. Think of all the priests and nuns that were butchered by the French Revolution. Do you know there were, in the space of about 3 years, 45,000 Frenchmen were killed in the Reign of Terror? 45,000 in the space of 3 years. The church was devastated. And so things, I think, actually have been worse. They have been killing Christians in the Middle East for a long time. I'm not downgrading that at all, but I wouldn't point to a letter by Pope Francis on marriage as the match that lights the chaos. We've had these problems for a long time. Yes? Yeah, I guess as a spiritual matter, I try not to let myself get distracted by these things. It's pretty clear to me what my faith calls me to do, and I don't want or seek these distractions, because that's what they are ultimately. Now, if I have an ability to influence it, absolutely. But there's nothing I can do about conversations Pope Francis has with cardinals that are liberal, let's say, or misguided, etc. And is it even productive to dwell on that if I can't change it? Now, I can influence my local situation, the priests, the bishops here, etc., on some level. But to reflect on that too deeply is, I think, in some ways counterproductive to just my own personal spirituality and faith.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. I agree with that. Yeah. Well, good. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Hope to see you this summer at Gorton.